It's my pleasure to introduce Signe Nielsen, and I'm wearing my craft hat. Signe has a, I think they Signe Nielsen is principal of Matthews Nielsen, sorry. Matthews Nielsen Landscape Architects, thank you. And it is a 25-person firm based out of New York City, doing a lot of work in especially urban environments in and around the city and other places. But specializes mostly in waterfronts, sustainability, and is now starting to work on historic sites as well. And Signe has a interesting background that hopefully she will talk about. She has 4 different degrees. We're in poli-sci, landscape architecture, construction management, and civil engineering. And those all play very well into the practice that she does that's very public interface intensive. So with that, I will give you the floor.
Thank you for having me. We're making apologies for your weather, but I can tell you that when I left New York City this morning, it was exactly the same weather as you're having here, so no need to apologize. I think the only thing I'll say about those 4 degrees is they span about 30 years. With the most recent one I got in 2001, and I timed it for the same year as my daughter's graduation from college. So will I get another one? Probably. It's just something I love doing, like I love teaching. So even though I fundamentally am a practitioner, teaching and learning are something that are just sort of part of my life. I'm going to talk today about 4 projects that we have done and are in the process of doing, all relating to urban waterfronts in and around the New York area. And the title is called Turning the Tide, and that is both literal as well as kind of symbolic, and I hope to kind of inspire you as we go along. So what are we turning the tide from, and what does turning the tide really mean? And the way I've interpreted it is we are reclamation, revitalization of the waterfront to change its traditional use, particularly in urban areas, from a place that received goods and was a transportation corridor to now something where people flow to the water instead of things flowing from the water to the land, seeking to reverse that, that process. So the specific elements that, as I said, we're turning the tide from, it seems to me, is, again, in particularly urban areas, centuries of landfill, piers, platforms, and other interventions into the harbors and estuaries in order to accommodate shipping. This is what is today Battery Park City, done it back in 1974. Actually, I kind of like this mouse. So right here, this is the area that has the fill from the World Trade Center site, and then to the north and the south, where the sand looks whiter, that was imported from up the Hudson River. So there, that landfill filled in 25 piers that had existed previously along that corridor at a rhythm that you can see still exists north of the site. Another thing we're reclaiming from is centuries of degradation to the shoreline. A lot of it unintentional. We just didn't know what we were doing. In the kinds of industries that we built, the kind of effluence that came from those industries left a very degraded environmental condition, both in the upland and at the interface with water, and clearly, of course, in the water itself. Then we have also a huge legacy of structures that were built for a prior purpose. You are in the Brooklyn side of the East River. You're looking at the large warehouses that used to receive, lumber and container shipping. And then on the Brooklyn side of the East River, you're seeing the Domino Sugar Plant. So these are all the kinds of activities that needed to be near water because of how goods were brought in and then finished products taken away. But today, particularly in large cities, it's no longer practical to use the water in this way. It's been replaced by trucking. And so these shorelines now have the opportunity to be altered. So what I'm going to talk about today is how these sort of layers of history have been eradicated and how we might bring them back and how we might reclaim them for people. So why has this opportunity arisen all of a sudden? It's actually not all of a sudden. It's been happening over a period of about 30 years. And as our urban areas have gotten denser, we're running out of land for people to recreate. And so people are now looking back to the shoreline as an opportunity, as really land that is waiting to be reclaimed for a new use. This is a project I'll talk about later, Hudson River Park, that I worked on. The other thing is that many industrialized nations are finding, believe it or not, you don't laugh, an increase in leisure time, which you presently don't have, but you may someday, and that there is a growing demand for a diversity of recreation, and people are actually moving back to the cities with families. And so there's a desire for an increase in the type of recreational opportunities that the city can have. We're also looking finally at the shoreline as something we can restore to have some kind of environmental sustainability. And we are actually bringing transportation back, particularly in New York, in the form of commuter transportation. So it has a much less impact to the shoreline, but it is at least reviving some use of the water as a transportation artery. So what I'm going to talk about today are four projects, each of which represent some form of reclamation and revitalization. I'm going to start with the earliest one that is built. This is Fulton Landing Pier in Brooklyn, immediately south of the Brooklyn Bridge that you see in this photograph here. First, I'm calling this sort of an example of a cultural reclamation that has a fairly high level of historic interpretation woven into it. I'm going to start on the upper left slide. The site has been in continuous use as a ferry landing since the early 18th century, because it is actually the closest distance between Manhattan and Brooklyn. And so way back then, even the Native Americans were using it as a launch between Manhattan and Brooklyn. It then went into use as a, where'd you go, baby? Puppy. There we go. Then the Dutch started to use it. Then the East River became a very, very active waterway. And in fact, it got so busy that by the middle of the 1800s, there were over 1,000 trips a day between Brooklyn and Manhattan, leaving from various points on the Brooklyn shoreline. And they were having tremendous congestion, and a number of ferries sank, and a lot of lives were lost, which is actually why the Brooklyn Bridge was built, was to alleviate the congestion of boat traffic in the East River. So what we had when I first started this project, shown down here on the lower right, was a spit of land that was part of the original beach, surrounded by a deteriorated and burned U-shaped deck. And then sort of the only constituency of the site, this converted coffee barge into a concert venue. Sounds odd, but the woman who did it is an absolutely incredible human being. She took this steel coffee barge, which had, as you can imagine, the world's worst acoustics. She lined it with scrap from the Staten Island ferries that they were decommissioning. So it's all wood paneled, and it has incredible acoustics. And at the west end of the barge, where there's an unbelievable view of the setting sun, she put in a plate glass window and a $10,000 Steinway piano. And she felt that the people of Brooklyn really didn't have access to classical music. And so this is her contribution to Brooklyn, and it's enormously successful. Anyway, she was the only constituency on the site. It was otherwise totally abandoned. And so I began looking at this and thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do down here? It's at the end of a long street, a lot of traffic. There's an old building here, and this building was in active use as a fireboat house. We used to fight fires, obviously from the water. We just pump the water out of the rivers and fight any of the industrial fires along the shores. And then the hoses would dry in this tall tower here, and then the hoses were stored to be put on the fireboat over here. And so these were landmark buildings that I had to keep. And the city of Brooklyn said, we want you to turn this into a public recreation asset. So I looked at it. The project was completed in, you can read the facts. I thought about many different ways to design this pier. And like a lot of projects, you start with 1,000 ideas. And what I do is I come up with my 1,000 ideas. Usually I have 3 or 4 too many. And so I go to the site. And when I go to the site, I look at it and I realize that, first of all, it's become much bigger in my mind than it really is. And that it's actually very small. And what the hell did I think I was doing trying to put all that program onto this very little space? The site is 110 by 150. So it's very small, the wood deck part of the pier. And so all of these gyrations that I had in my mind of level changes and overlooks and platforms and whatnot, it just seemed ridiculous. It was making an already small space too small. So in the end, I kind of did nothing. I built a pier out of concrete, got rid of the wood piles, put a concrete deck, and then a wood surface on top of it, and then a simple railing around the perimeter. And then I thought, well, there's got to be more to this design than just that. You could have hired an engineer, a marine engineer, to do that. So what can I bring to this? What I sort of call value added? What contribution can I make? And I realized that what is remarkable about this site is its continuous use over a very sustained and dynamic series of changes in Brooklyn and the Manhattan harbor. So that's what I decided to express in this project. So, and barge music is doing great, by the way. So one of the things that is most prominent on the pier is the railing. It's a code requirement. So the railing is a combination of 2 designs. At its lower level, it's the same design from here down, and that is obviously very evocative of the cabling system of the Brooklyn Bridge. And then where they differ is in this upper piece here. And for the majority of the pier, it is this, which is a Native American motif from baskets that were found on the site. And then around the west end of the pier and a little bit on the north and south sides is a poem by Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman used to be an editor of a local Brooklyn newspaper whose publishing house is just half a block away from the site. And he wrote a poem called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And it's about the experience of going from Brooklyn to Manhattan and seeing the sunset and being out on the water. And so I took one stanza of that poem and put it in laser cut stainless steel. The reason I didn't continue it all the way around is that there are 4 gates in order to access barge music and then the commuter ferry, and I didn't want the gate to open and break the poetry. So that's why I went to just a geometric design. In another part of the pier, I've got these bronze plaques, and some of the bronze plaques sort of bring the history to life, and these are real drawings. I didn't draw these. This is the image of the Native American longhouses, and this is how you actually got the ferry from Brooklyn to Manhattan. You just called with a horn, and then the guy would go in the water and go over and get you. And then there are 5 of these bronze maps that depict the history of Brooklyn, basically at 70-year intervals, and I got those maps from the New York Public Library. This is not a spelling error. Tall mass of Mannahatta. That was the name of the Native American tribe, was the Mannahatta. So there you can kind of see, and to me it's just incredibly evocative of place. And then on the down here, that's a bronze, much larger version of the original ticket, round-trip ticket on the Fulton Ferry, Fulton steamship ferry, and it went from Fulton Street in Brooklyn to Fulton Street in Manhattan. And I wanted people to understand that why there's a Fulton Street in both boroughs, and it's named for Robert Fulton. On a typical summer night, the pier looks like this. And one of the things I was thinking about is that the pier has to serve many different kinds of people. It is now part of the tourist bus route, and so people get out. They have 15 minutes to take like the classic photograph of their honey against the backdrop of the Manhattan skyline. And then there are people who live in the neighborhood who come back, weekend after weekend, or day after day, or come down and just, breathe the air. And so what would bring them back time and again? And what would not compete with this extraordinary skyline? And I think that's what ultimately I decided, is that less was more, because I could never compete with that backdrop, not the bridge, not the skyline, and that if you want to explore the pier and go back there a few times, you can look at the bronze plaques, you can read the poetry, but if you're only there for 15 minutes, you probably don't even notice, and that's fine too. The next project that we did is in Irvington, New York. It's about 30 miles up the Hudson from Manhattan. And this was what's called a relieving platform. It's built out into the Hudson River. It's 12 acres, and here's the rail line. So that obviously is what brought the raw material to the site and also transported the finished materials out of the site. Some of it was also brought in by boat. And it was an active lumber yard, which is what you're looking at here. And this is in 1957. The lumber yard went out of business and left a seriously degraded and contaminated site. Subsequently, the relieving platform collapsed, which is what you're looking at here. And you can see where it was once supported on piles over here. But needless to say, this collapsed relieving platform gave me the big idea, as they say. The site is located in the town of Irvington for Washington Irving, the writer, located at the end of Main Street, which is how you access the site. Then you have to cross the railroad and then get in over here. So there's only one point of access into the site, which is definitely a challenge. So the program, which we developed with the residents of Irvington, there are about 6,000 residents, and we had open town hall meetings, and we asked them what they wanted to see. And there was a large demand for active recreation, but there was also a large demand for just being out that kind of that extra little bit into the Hudson River and being able to look across the way at the New Jersey Palisades. They're not screwed up at that point. And looking down at Manhattan, which you'll see, and just being quiet. So the design is very simple. As I said, you enter here, and then the site sort of evolves from its most active at the north, and then getting quieter and quieter, and then eventually is just a completely passive open area at the south with a kayak launch over here. There is vehicular access in the studio that I participated in this afternoon. We got into a discussion of, how far will people walk from a car? And would they walk to this site at all? And that was a big debate, I will just say. I wanted, of course, no parking, no road into the site, but I'm from Manhattan and they're not, so I lost. The site today is very, very well used. It is it has 2 ball fields and a overlapping soccer field. It meets the needs of not just the school system of Irvington, but also of the surrounding neighborhood. And it is used a lot by neighborhood residents. The key thing about this project is it was the first project in New York State built with what's called Environmental Quality Bond Act money, which was put into place by Governor Pataki for the purposes of reclaiming severely degraded sites. And so this site, all of the chemicals from the lumberyard, as well as PCBs from the rail lines, had penetrated the soil. And when it rained, those contaminants were flowing into the Hudson River. And so this was actually a point source for pollution of the Hudson River, which is why the money was given to this site. And so we actually capped the site above and then wrapped it down so that no moisture can penetrate that contaminated soil. We were not allowed to take any soil off-site, and we were not allowed to move it around on-site. So we were greatly limited in what we could do, which is why the site is kind of, unfortunately, dead flat. It is, and then on top of the cap, which is a water impermeable cap, is 2.5 feet of soil. And it meant that all of our utility systems and all the roots of all the vegetation cannot penetrate that cap, which is meant that we selected certain species of plants that, of course, don't have tap roots and such, can grow just laterally. This is, so the idea that I talked about before when I saw the collapsed relieving platform was, well, instead of a hard edge, let's make a soft edge. It's what's called an armored edge, because there are very strong currents in the Hudson River. So it can't just be grass going down, because there's an 8-foot tidal fluctuation on the river. So it would, and then with the 4.5 knot currents, it would just, it wouldn't hold the soil, and then we'd violate the cap and blah, blah, blah. So this is called an armored edge. It's also known as riprap. It's just large stones that we transported down from Albany by boat to save trucking. Also, the bridge was not very strong. So it was installed, and one of the things I'm most pleased about is that there's no railing. So you sort of feel that you're closer to the water, and people do walk down right onto it. And then at the upper photograph here, you're actually looking down at Manhattan over here. And there's the Palisades. You know, New Jersey gets a bad rap, but up here it's really quite nice. We used vegetation that can withstand flooding, because the site will flood in spring high tides, and it's within the 50-year floodplain, which, as you know, is now becoming more frequent than 50 years. And so it's all saline tolerant. The Hudson River does have salt in it at this point, even though it's inland a bit. There's another great view of Manhattan down here. And then we have a little bit of bulkhead that we put in really because we didn't have a decent outfield in one of the fields. So there's a little bit of bulkhead there. So saline tolerant plants. You know, this to me, you know, how do you know that your job was successful, or how do you have a feeling of success? This to me is the sign of success. Two people sitting on a bench, obviously having a nice communication with each other, looking out, sort of sunset, somebody's windsurfing, taking advantage of the water now in a wholly different way that water has been thought about. Hudson River, ooh, you never go in it. Now people are swimming in it, boating in it, windsurfing in it, looking at it, appreciating it. And so anyway, I call it the sweet smell of a successful project. And that, you know, I go back a lot to my sites and just see how people are using it. I learn from that, things I never would have thought about. So it's, you know, sort of, I guess, what's it called? Post-occupancy evaluation. The third project is one I wanted to point out that being a landscape architect, planner, or architect requires just unbelievable stamina in terms of patience. And this is a project that I started in 1993, and it will not be completed until 2010, assuming that we don't lose any more funding. I started out doing the master plan for Hudson River Park. It is a 5.5 mile long park along the west side of Manhattan. You think that I've never gotten out of the Hudson River, but no, I started to do the East River. It runs from the north end of Battery Park. Actually, it runs from the Battery, the southernmost point of Manhattan, up to the 59th Street, or the point at which the highway becomes an elevated structure, if you've ever been there. So that's about 5.5 miles. This is just a smattering of photographs of what it looked like. The park itself comprises 13 recreation piers out of a total of 33 piers that still exist along the west side. It is a very narrow bit of land, ranging from, at its widest, 100 feet, to its narrowest of 10 feet. And it is adjacent to the reconstructed West Side Highway that I also worked on. One of the things that we looked at when coming up with the master plan was, you know, what kind of the nature taking over these piers. This is vegetation growing out of creosoted piles and decking. We had an ecologist actually document 40 different species of vegetation just growing in cracks of concrete, asphalt, and on these timber piers. This is kind of a feeling of how wide the part of the park is. There is a historic bulkhead made out of granite in some areas. And then there are these incredible piers that stick out into the river, anywhere from 800 to 1,100 feet. And then there are some really great old structures that are still there. So we used a variety of different extant elements to draw inspiration from. But basically, it would be called a complete gut rehab because the piers are severely deteriorating. All the wood piles have been eaten by marine borer. They're structurally in a state of complete collapse. You could put no load on them, and so they are, all 13 piers are completely reconstructed. The top image here is the whole park. And so it sort of shows you graphically the idea of land and water kind of weaving themselves in a new way, and kind of what some of the inspirational themes are for the park of art and history and ecology. And then at the bottom are just the schematic design drawings of two discrete areas of the park that I won't really go into. But so we did the master plan. We carried it to about the schematic level in order to develop cost estimates and also to begin the approval process. There were 35 different federal, state, and city agencies that we needed approval from to make this happen. And we also needed $400 million. So I was talking to some of you before about, once you sort of had your design figured out, how were you going to sell it? And this was one of those moments where when we first started the master plan, the governor and the mayor each committed $100 million to the project, so we were kind of halfway there. But then about halfway through the master plan, we had a financial catastrophe in the city of New York, and both the governor and the mayor pulled out their $100 million, so we were like nowhere. So how are we going to raise $400 million? You got to have one hell of a compelling idea. And so selling this job back to the state, back to the feds, back to the city, and slowly, slowly, slowly. So we're now at $384 million, but of course costs have continued to rise since 1997 when we finished the master plan. So we're always like $20 million behind the 8 ball. These are some early sketches we did, just evoking different things. We had this idea of, what are you going to do with 13 recreation piers? Well, I don't know, you could do a lot of different things. So this was an idea, I was going to turn it into a gigantic skateboard venue, and then we decided that was like wildly too hazardous because people would be like flying off the ramps into the water, or we'd have to put up, the railings would be too high, and then you sort of, why the hell are you doing that on the water? And so we abandoned that idea. Then we had this landform, which we did actually persist with, to block the park from the road. And so there's a kind of a dense vegetated buffer. The road is over here, the highway. And then you could also have a little bit of a high point. And so you could sit up here, and people could walk down here on the esplanade, and you could look over them. So people wouldn't be walking in front of you as you're kind of romanticizing about the river. And then I fell in love with these sheds, these pier sheds. And so I thought, well, if you stripped off all of their kind of grungy metal exterior and you put in glass garage doors, you could turn it in. And mind you, this thing's 1,000 feet long and 125 feet wide. You could have indoor basketball, you could have outdoor movies, and you could also make a space that would be nice or pleasant, at least in the winter, because the Hudson River is about as unfriendly a space as you'd want to be on in the winter, kind of like being on Chicago's lakefront. So that seemed like an idea. And then we were also trying to figure out, how do you get people closer to the water, even wet, and even like in the water. So we explored all different things there. So the park is about, it's about 50% built at this point, and we are now working on what's called segment 3, which is actually the southernmost section. But what has kind of driven our thinking in terms of the landscape are these different typologies, and without going into them in great length, up here you'll see sort of a concept idea and then the built reality, and sometimes they're close and sometimes they're not that close. That's kind of what happens after 15 years of working on a project. Constituencies change, clients change, agencies that gave you approval 10 years ago changed their mind. So it's difficult to kind of keep your eye on the ball and hope that it happens. Anyway, so this is the idea of as boundless a landscape as you can get in New York. I know, again, we were talking today in your studio about these different kinds of landscape types that you were creating. The idea that you actually can see distance, you can see horizon. Because one of the really desperate things about living in an urban area is there's no horizon. And that's a rare opportunity. And even here is not much of a horizon. It's New Jersey, but what can you do? The idea of a civic landscape, that in fact you would create a construct that people would inhabit and use in different ways, in kind of more programmed ways, if you will. Whether it's the ferry, the water taxi stop we have over here. This is a model we built, a rather ultra-realistic model. And we have the Esplanade, and then here's what it is today. It's not bad. This one's not bad. And shade structures, because it's kind of brutally hot. This is also part of the model we built, one of the piers, and then this is a built pier today. So again, it kind of the urban landscape. You know, it's obviously a completely artificial landform. You're out on a man-made platform 1,000 feet into the river. You can't really pretend that that's natural. And so, you know, how do you interpret that as kind of an urban typology of landscape? And then there is the natural, and we're attempting to bring back the natural, not just from the standpoint of experiential, but also in terms of sustainable. And so, again, on the upper image here is an idea we had in the schematic design phase, and this is something we're working on right now. One of the unfortunate things is our inability to alter the shoreline. And unlike what we were able to do in Irvington, we were subject to very, very strict navigation controls, all kinds of ridiculous things having to do with military security, the Coast Guard, the Federal Aviation, believe it or not, because of helicopter access and whatnot. And then after September 11th, everything got even more strict. So anyway, it's not as natural as we had envisioned in our master plan. So this is the Greenwich Village area that was completed in 2001. The northern area was completed in 2005. The section I'm working on right now is going to be completed, as I said, about 2010. And I'm projecting that the total cost by then is going to be about $450 million. But it really has transformed Manhattan's West Side, and as evidenced by all of the kind of designer architecture that is now cropping up along the edge. The last project I'm going to talk about is one that I'm currently working on we've just finished the master plan. It's near and dear to my heart. It kind of represents, I think, everything that I'm about right now, which is bringing back the waterfront for people, really looking seriously at what sustainability means, and I've now really expanded that way beyond environmental sustainability to aspects of economics and social sustainability, or what is sort of called environmental justice. After all, let's not forget I was a political science major first, and was driven into urban planning and urban design out of a desire to improve the urban condition, not out of some artistic background to create artistic landscapes. But I am a deeply social and political animal. And this project, I think, in a lot of ways coalesces that very early thinking with where I am today. And what better place to do it than the South Bronx, which even if you're not from the East Coast, I'm sure you've heard about the South Bronx as its reputation precedes it. However, back in 1607, it was a very wild area that was inhabited by the Native Americans, particularly because it was rich in oysters and animals for trapping, raccoons, deer, and such. It was a wetland, which is why it was such a rich land for oysters and shellfish. And in 1607, some Dutch guy moved in, and that's his house, and that's his buddy. And so they began to turn it into farmland slowly. By 1867, it still, as you can see, has a rather articulated shoreline based on its natural condition and the rivers and streams that flowed into it. And it was still really farmland. Those little black dots there represent the few houses that existed and one road. And that's the Bronx River there. And this is Long Island Sound, otherwise known as the East River. But it is not a river. It is an estuary. It has no outlet. And then there is a little bit of water over here, and that's called the Bronx Kill. Today, the site has been filled in progressively. And in the 1940s, the vast majority of the South Bronx Peninsula was a gigantic coal gasification plant. And this is the site today. So our project area, this is a highway. It's a major interstate trucking route. It's elevated. And that separates this part of the South Bronx from this part of the South Bronx. And it is a peninsula. So this is the Bronx River here. This is the East River. And then you can't really see the Bronx Kill here. That's Randall's Island. That's Rikers Island. That's our Alcatraz East. And the coal gasification facility used to be here. Today, the site is obviously heavily contaminated from that prior use. And it is now the largest food distribution center in the world. And so on the site, come here, sweetie. This is the produce market. This is the meat market. This is the fish market. And these are individual distributors of everything from beer to peanuts. And this is a gigantic sewage treatment plant. And on and on and on. So, oh, that's a prison barge. And that's a marine transfer station for garbage. So, our charge, this was a public project. All these are obviously public projects. We were hired by the city of New York to create a greenway. So, fine. Where? Well, that was the challenge. And so this is our final design, our master plan, which we finished this year. It was 2007, last year. So that's the highway. And it's in the same orientation as that aerial photograph, but it gets you all the way down now, and that's the Bronx Kill. And there's Rikers, and that's Manhattan. So we quickly realized that there was no way that we were going to get a continuous greenway in the traditional sense of the word around the peninsula. There were just way too many problems. So what we did negotiate, and here's where my political activism really helped out, is the property owner of the food distribution center was my client, City of New York. And I said, look, guys, you got to give us some land here. How do you expect us to put a greenway in here? So after a year and a half, I persuaded them that they had to negotiate 30 feet out of every lease renewal for any property that they controlled. And so slowly, we just got this piece of property, and we just got this piece of property, and we actually got that piece of property. And so slowly, we will, in the next 10 years, get the entire shoreline of the food distribution center. Then I looked at other pieces of available land. And this was a street, and I thought, well, we can take over the street. Then I looked at some of these streets, and I thought, geez, these are really wide. Maybe we can take over some of those. And then I looked at, anyway, on and on. What happened, obviously, is that I realized you could not get around this peninsula, and that we'd have to come up with a new concept for a greenway. And so that's really what this is about. It's a series of, it's what I call a network. It's a weaving of an inland greenway network with a more traditional waterfront network. So this is the 20-year plan. I'm in year 2. So I'll have grandchildren, hopefully, by then. But I'm working on it. And the blue represents the greenway along the water, and the green represents the greenway inland. And the dots of all different flavors represent current and future destinations. And these dots represent completely wishful thinking. But I want to instill in the minds of future anybody's politicians, local community activists, future property owners, that this greenway must go through. Because right now, there's no connection between the very small residential population that lives right here, population of 12,000, and the very small population of 600 that lives right here, and 16,000 workers in the food distribution center. And I want to get them from here to there. And right now they have to go onto this disgusting highway, or under this disgusting highway. So this is a seed that I am planting. And because this is going to go on, you know, I may be dead by then, but I want this to go on after my life. And then I also want there to be connections in the water. So right now, a great coup is I got the city to buy North Brother Island. Used to be a tuberculosis hospital. And so now this is being turned into a bird sanctuary. And I just got the state to buy South Brother Island. And so now I can actually change my arrows. I won't go on anymore. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of flavor of what it looks like. And again, where I get my inspiration from. There is relieving platform. People are currently fishing. There still is shellfish, and there still are fish. I don't recommend you eating them, but it is a poor community. It's a desperately poor community. 43% unemployment rate, 78% asthmatic rate, 28% of the population is on unemployment. The rest are on another form of subsidy. It's actually the poorest county in the country, and very close to the highest unemployment rate. So this fishing is not just recreational. There are large parts of the site that, in spite of their contamination, are coming back. There are large parts of the site that are just fenced off and abandoned. And so I walk around like a real estate developer. I walk around, I go, where can I get land? Where can I get land? What can I get? Where can I go? How can I connect these dots? How can I get them? And I've just got this compulsion about finding land. This is also showing you the less maybe beautiful aspects of the site. You've got you know, this unbelievable situation of this shoreline and then these trucks right along the edge. You can see here how close industry is to the Bronx River, and you're a spit away from this park over here, and on this side you're screwed. And you know, how do you create some kind of equity here? You've got some great old historic gantry structures. These used to transport loaded train cars directly onto rail tracks. Obviously we don't do that anymore, but the structures are cool, and so we're going to put a boat launch, a kayak launch in here, and you know, that's just kind of a gateway thing. And then we have another very unfortunate thing, which is what are called sewer outfalls. So all the sewage flows directly into the river, untreated. So that's a problem. You don't want to have too much active recreation right there, or fishing. This is the guiding principles of our master plan. So this is where I kind of am expressing this idea that sustainability goes beyond merely environmental reclamation. And so it's about economic development. It's about community economic development in particular, because the really horrific, I mean not horrific, but the inequity is that the food distribution center generates $4 billion worth of revenue for the city of New York. $4 billion. And what are they giving back to this community? They're giving back 32,000 truck trips a day. Anyway, I can go on and on. Oh, I'm very agitated. I mean, I'm very worked up about this project. Then I'm also looking at this project as a way to create economic benefit for the community, as well as jobs, job training, and long-term employment through the maintenance of the Greenway. And then obviously a really critical thing is urban health. Between the asthmatic rate, the obesity, it is absolutely critical. We developed the program In concert with the community, we had a variety of different sort of meeting strategies. We had large community forums. We had simultaneous translation in Spanish. We had smaller breakout groups with some of the property lessees and property owners. We had some of the local community groups that are already established. We met with them. We went to the schools. We went to the workforce, and we went to obviously the major employers. And we developed a master plan. I brought a copy with me if anyone wants to see it. It's about 200 pages. I got a little overexcited. It has in it these design guidelines. And the design guidelines are comprised of both what I call systems and materials. And so the idea of the systems is, remember, this is going to go on after I'm dead. And I want this to work. And I want people to believe that this is the right thing to do. And so it's about, in this particular page that I copied here, about stormwater control. Because of these sewer outfalls, we have to clean the water before it actually flows into these various estuaries. And then we did a whole series on just materials. And these are about different kinds of materials, some of which can be locally produced, because remember, I'm trying to make jobs out of this project. And some can be designed by local artists. There's also a staggering amount of waste-related products being brought to those gigantic recycling facilities. And so how can we make products out of stuff that's already being brought into Hunts Point, like glass and plastic and metal? And so some of it's about that, and then some of it is also integrating materials with stormwater management. And then these are some renderings. Again, for those students that I was talking to earlier, you've got to sell your project. The estimate, I don't know if you read the numbers before, if you look at my entire master plan, that's $220 million. That's a big stretch for the South Bronx. It's a big stretch for a rather small resident population. I have thus far, obviously through the help of a number of other advocates, we have a phase 1 project. We have $32 million committed to the phase 1 projects that comprise 5 separate projects. And we worked with the community very closely to identify what those first 5 projects would be. And this is one of them, Hunts Point Landing. It is a 100-foot wide abandoned road. We are demapping it, and it will take us directly to the water. It's 800 feet long, 100 feet wide. Highly contaminated, and a continuous slope down to the water. So there'll be an upland portion of it. Yes, you can drive to this site because you're about a mile from the nearest resident population. And then the site kind of breaks, and it becomes more of a waterfront experience. We've actually changed our mind since we did this rendering, and we're now creating an intertidal wetland, a new pier. We were able to get transferring shade rights and other fancy deals that we made with the Army Corps of Engineers. And so instead of this, condition now, you'll be able to step down into the water can come up onto the land, and you can see the interactive process, both as an educational opportunity for the local schools, as well as, again, a water cleansing, both water from the aquatic habitat, as well as the stormwater discharge. This is Lafayette Avenue. It's the main residential street, and I saw this painted median, and I thought, well, what a waste. Why don't we just occupy that median? Doesn't look like a big stretch to me. So we went to this Department of Transportation, and they said, okay, well, as long as we have striped it, I guess you can use it. So all we did is we put up 2 barriers and some fencing. I mean, this is the goal. I have yet to get final approval on this. And then put in 26 feet of program. And so the idea is that, people come out of their houses, and it's a largely Hispanic population. And there's a lot of domino playing, a lot of card playing, a lot of, kids need a place to kind of play. And so we thought, well, I don't know, can we support community gardens? Maybe. People can look out of their window and kind of supervise. Jump roping, maybe. I don't know. We have to take this back to the community and work with them more now that I actually sold the idea, which I didn't think I was actually going to be able to do. This is, we have a variety of different shoreline conditions. This is one just to show you what we're going to do in that precious 30 feet that we've gotten, and how we're going to allocate the 30 feet. So we have a shared use path that includes both a bikeway and a pedestrian way. We're going to need some kind of buffer between all of these trucking facilities over here, and then we want to have some kind of restoration. Again, water cleansing, no curbs, and aquatic restoration. So again, it's where land and water meet, that, the richest ecosystem of all, and that's just kind of a plan view. And then this turned out to be one of the great finds in my binocular search for land. This is a elevated rail track. It's Metro North. It's one of our major Northeast Corridor commuter routes. And it's elevated in order to just sort of fly across the Bronx and Queens and get into Manhattan. And underneath it is this really unbelievable space. So I said, well, who controls this? And why can't I have it? And so they said, well, I guess so. And it turns out that there's millions of layers. It's owned by the State Department of Transportation. Our local utility company has an easement because they have high tension electric lines underground. And then these guys over here, where are you? They've kind of encroached because they needed a little bit more parking, and then this rail line has kind of put all of its crap over the edge here. And anyway, so slowly, and then of course I have to get agreement from these guys up here that drop debris onto the site. But anyway, slowly, we're nearly there. In another 6 months, we will have 99-year control over this easement. And it's 1,200 feet long, and it's actually going to get you from the Bronx to Manhattan without having to go up on a bridge, which is just fantastic. So that's my conclusion. I guess I do have a stirring conclusion, which I have to read you. So it's kind of corny. Together we can turn the tide and reconnect people to the urban waterfronts and implement changes that will allow natural systems to establish and thrive sustainably. Reclaiming the edge means recognizing and celebrating the relationships between the past and the present, between natural and cultural processes, and between people and their urban environment. Thanks. I guess I shouldn't turn it.